All right. The NFL's fantasy football season is over. The regular season is over. Ah, let me. Terrible intro to the episode. It's a live episode. But, anyways, I'm going to discuss being a sports fan in 2025 and how things have changed throughout my life on this episode of the Scho-Zone. All right, everybody, welcome to the Scho-Zone. I am your host, Ryan Schofield, coming at you live from the little Degencent I have going on here. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Like, subscribe, comment, share, all of that douchebag stuff that podcast hosts like myself say. Welcome aboard. Welcome to the Scho-Zone. Completely botched that intro, by the way. I really need to do better on those. I don't know whether I should be doing these live. I don't know if we should be doing them pre-recorded. I don't know if there should be a video element to them. I don't know if I should just be doing my podcast or just doing the audio on there. Who knows? I'm organized chaos as far as I'm concerned. Just throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. But I did think that this episode might be getting some traction because one thing I've noticed is, just kind of from the stop here, not a real big fan of fantasy football. It's no secret. If anyone that follows me on any of the social medias that scroll on here, this is the first year I didn't play. It was such a relaxing, liberating experience. I think it's terrible. I think it's stupid. And I'm going to elaborate on that throughout the course of this episode. I also don't understand that if I ever want to get any engagement, it seems like that's maybe why the master plan behind all of this is. If I ever want to get any engagement on any type of social media, or if I want to put up a short on YouTube or something on TikTok, if I just say something negative about fantasy football, the amount of interactions that I get go through the roof compared to just when I just say something regular. And it's always met with the same one of that people think that me not playing fantasy sports is a miserable way to go about life. For me, having the attitude that I have towards fantasy sports is a miserable way of going about life. And I've examined this pretty closely. I think the opposite of this one. I think that someone who really is obsessed with fantasy sports is a pretty miserable way to go through life. And like I said, I'll elaborate on all of that. And I also think that fantasy sports are just obsolete at this point now. We have legalized gambling, so there's really just not much of a need for it. And it's something that I'm pretty knowledgeable on. I mean, I probably have mentioned this on other episodes. This is actually something that I did on my favorite episode that I ever recorded that there was no audio on. Again, if you ever want to look back through my previous episodes and see the David Montgomery episode, which maybe did I end up deleting it or not? Anyways, I did a whole rant on David Montgomery when he was talking about how fantasy sports owners made him suicidal. And I recorded this whole epic hour straight rant that I felt really good about when it was over with. And then the next day when I went to listen to it, I realized my mic was not on. My mic is on right now, so we're off to a good start on this one. And again, for anybody that listens to this, before, I might be rehashing on some topics. This is for new people. I only have so many loyal listeners, and thank you so much for all of you that do contribute, and the people who do message out to me and say, hey, when's the next episode coming? It is really encouraging because sometimes this just can be a little bit defeating and deflating, doing the amateur podcast thing, especially when, it's not my primary objective in life. It should be. I should take this a little more seriously. One of the beautiful things about this is that you get out what you put in. Maybe I don't put in enough. Maybe I'm not as I mentioned on the last episode, just not as clever as I thought I was when there's a bunch of other people out here that want to talk about the same things. So that's why I like to try and come up with my own little niche on here. I'm not just saying things just to say them. Everything I do truly believe. I don't just form opinions to be different. And I'm not just trying to appease everybody. If you want me to sit here and do an episode on how great fantasy football is or whatever, I would really not like if that became popular. But so I always trace this one back to the beginning with fantasy, as far as the reason it came to be in existence was because gambling was illegal and some people did not like, and not that gambling wasn't going on, but some people who maybe didn't feel as comfortable getting involved with an illegal bookmaker or, just doesn't like to put up that kind of money on an individual game. That's where fantasy was born out of. Again, fantasy actually also started with baseball. Down the road on this one, it was rotisserie baseball was the original fantasy sports group of investment bankers or lawyers or something like that their way of deciding who would be the baseball general manager, they came up with this whole idea for fantasy sports sometime around, I think, like the late 70s or early 80s or so. I remember as a kid it evolving into the fantasy football thing where the idea of doing the drafts, I mean, it was a tough product to pull off pre-internet as far as all the stats had to be done manually. As far as trades and just interacting amongst other people must have been a little more difficult. But fantasy, I really want to say, took a nice surge. Sometime I want to feel like, again, we're probably around the internet, but I want to say sometime around the late 90s, early 2000s or so. I think that my first real serious fantasy football league that was amongst friends, and this is also, I should talk about when I was in high school, when maturity is at an all-time high, obviously, was around then. And everyone became excited by the idea of, let's put up a little bit of money and be able to win it at the end. For the amount of time that the football season lasts, it's just, I mean, if you win a fantasy football, you have to really, really enjoy fantasy. I was going to say, but I just look at it as being a glorified lottery ticket. And one of the responses I do get all the time from people when I say how I hate fantasy, they're like, "Oh, you just don't have any friends to," I always love that people are so much more likely to leave a negative comment than a positive one. Or, I mean, if people don't agree with me, they don't agree with me. I don't expect them to comment on that one. But it is amazing how I can strike a nerve with people so much because of my attitude towards hating fantasy football. Yeah, there was a period of time where I would have thought that was crazy. It was about 15 years ago, maybe. A lot has changed in the world since then, and I don't understand what people are hanging on to with fantasy, where it doesn't seem like, I mean, from being on the outside looking in, it does not seem like a fun experience whatsoever. I mean, I literally just look at people complaining about, this guy needed this many catches and they called this back or whatever, or, this guy got hurt. So much stuff that is beyond your control. I mean, now I do say this as a guy who gambles on sports. I still don't have any control on the outcomes on them, but I have more control over what my interest levels are, I guess would be a way that I would say. But trying to kind of, I don't really, even if I was to write any of this stuff down or actually prepare a presentation, I would never stick to it. I mean, I might just have some fresh bullet points in my head. But anyways, yeah. So my war on fantasy sports, it's to the point where, I mean, my interest in sports is usually what's going to happen in the game or whatever. And, amongst friends who gamble, we might discuss a wager or two here or there. We might, have an idea or, oh, this is, I need this, I need that. But even nobody else cares. Okay. That's the whole point of going on this. I remember really in the peak of fantasy, like I said, about 15 years ago, I would say, I remember bartenders used to mockingly, anytime someone scored a touchdown, that the bar I used to hung at used to always just, the guys used to say, "Oh, he's on my fantasy team. He's on my fantasy team." And you would get the people responding, "Oh, he's on my team too." They didn't realize that the guy was trolling, okay? Because it was annoying that whenever somebody would watch a game at the bar, it wasn't that they needed to, they needed to announce to the world who they were rooting for, where suddenly it was like they want me to watch the game through their rooting interests, not my own kind of thing, which was already enough. And it just kind of turns to this whole thing of that I don't understand. I'm trying to think about this one out loud right now. Is that, I mean, it's trying to, keep myself level headed right now. Is that I have a show where I talk about sports, which is kind of a little bit of an implication. I mean, and I talk about sports and I don't really like them as much anymore. And I don't mean to sound this as a, like that whole douchebag kind of thing, but it's amazing how getting a girlfriend changes things. And I'm not saying that that's, people that play fantasy sports need to get a fucking life and get a girlfriend. I'm just saying that if you had to start prioritizing certain things over one another, you might choose one over the other. And if you choose fantasy sports over a female or whatever you're into, hey, kudos to you. If it actually makes you happy. My whole point of this one is that I don't think that people actually have a good time playing fantasy is the point of this one. Let's just think about what goes into this one, okay? I'm going to think of the last fantasy football league I played in. I played amongst some coworkers or whatever. For starters, it's ridiculous enough that, so we have to, it was $100 for everybody in the league or something like that. So $100, and I think there was 12 teams in the league. So there's a $1,200 prize pool. First, we have to vote on how we even disperse the money out. Nobody even agreed on that one. We had to figure out a whole way. I mean, at one point in time, somebody that was running our league, they wanted that we couldn't trust anybody apparently with the money. That's another thing of that, we're playing with amongst friends and coworkers where we all work at the same place. And in the environment I worked in, we all know what each other made. And yet somehow, for some reason, people couldn't trust each other for someone to hold on to that money. I mean, there's the whole pain in the ass of getting people to pay their league dues. As far as I'm concerned, you can't draft a team until you have your money in. That's just right off the rip. Should always be the rule of any fantasy league I would ever want to play in. Again, I only play in one league at this point in time now. It's a baseball league. We'll go into the fantasy baseball versus fantasy football conversation in just a moment. But you get this whole thing. You draft in. I mean, I always like the idea of drafting as late as possible, just because you're going to have injuries. I mean, football, people get hurt or whatever, and it does suck having some kind of, which kind of just goes to the point of that, you do anybody like there. I'm already seeing right now that people have fantasy rankings for next year, which is okay. All right. For the Matthew Berrys of the world, I mean, it's amazing that this guy's been able to make a living as long as he possibly can off of such a niche thing. And, kudos to him. I wish I could do it, but it's just that to me, it's kind of almost falls in that same thing as, like I said, like the Hawk Tua in the Jersey Shore things, is that if anyone's upset that somebody gets to make a living, and he's not, he's right a bunch of the times, he's wrong a bunch of the time. That's what happens when you put as many opinions out there. But I try to not pay attention to him, but unfortunately, Twitter suggests that I should listen to people. The fact that anyone has fantasy football rankings on there, we are going to have anybody that is researching any of that stuff is just a complete. I mean, if it makes your day better, by all means, but it seems to be a complete waste of time when rosters are going to change in the next couple of months. Guys are going to get injured. Guys just get old over a sudden. I mean, I would just encourage anybody to look at the fantasy football preview from before this season and then compare it to the results of the season, and do that for every year, by the way. And you're going to find out that most off-season stuff is a complete waste of time. So anyways, you put up $100, in August, late August. Congratulations. If you won your league, you just got paid, provided that you could actually get paid in time by the commissioner in your league. You just got paid sometime around Christmas or so. So that's 1, 2, 3, about 3.5 months or so. So that when, most fantasy seasons, I think, run about like 16 or 17 weeks or so. Another conversation for that one is that how long it goes. And by the way, also look at the rosters that were deciding fantasy football championships. Okay. Week 17, I believe, is when most people had theirs. Half the quarterbacks that started the season aren't even there. We're down to the nitty gritty of things. I mean, and I've won some fantasy leagues in my day with some. The reason I started getting out of this, like I said, is that Joe Flacco led me to a second place finish in a league last year. Joe Flacco, who I don't think started even playing in the NFL till about week 8 or week 9. And I only ended up with him by dumb luck because they had injuries to my quarterbacks that I needed to have a quarterback out there. And all of a sudden, this guy who never factored into the decision-making whatsoever, all of a sudden just starts balling out. And that's now takes my shitty-ass NFL team, which, by the way, Amari Cooper was a terrible draft pick up to that point. I don't think I could even drop him in the format I was playing, and nobody wanted to trade for him. And now suddenly I've got one of the best quarterback wide receiver combos. I am a genius, and I should be rewarded financially for my genius. Or I just had some dumb luck. That's what it all comes down to. I mean, again, it's just a big, it's a glorified lottery ticket. But even if I had won that league that I was discussing right now, and this is just kind of for everybody else, it's 3.5 months of my time, something I have absolutely no control over whatsoever. And these people who want to talk like they're fantasy experts, yeah, you can look at matchup data and stuff like that. There might be some little tells here and there. Here's the whole skill of fantasy football. Draft guys that don't get hurt and hope that they score touchdowns in the week that you're playing. Nothing drives me. There's always that whole thing of that. There's the people who I've seen it in my own time against leagues. There was one guy who probably had the best team in our league, but he always just happened to play the wrong team every week. I think he had the second most points scored and had the worst record or whatever. And cool, you paid $100 to be able to tell that sob story to everybody that doesn't care. That's just basically how we go with this one. I do get the idea that it does. I mean, the NFL, I'm sure, loves encouraging fantasy because it gives you a reason to care about games that you otherwise would not care about. But if I am watching a game, just for my own benefit, if I'm watching a fucking Titans Jaguars game because I have a wide receiver out there, I am having a miserable time watching that game because I'm now watching it for the most selfish of all reasons. I just want to see every pass thrown some way. And you can see in the comments on the internet with people following on this stuff with that, was that everything, they put the game on them. It's just all about them at this point. And it's everything that doesn't go their way. It's all some mass conspiracy against them. I swear to God, it's absolutely fascinating. But I if you have the tradition of playing in a league, I get that. I broke that one finally. I mean, I was in a league with some friends. Once we stopped drafting in person, I say that things really started kind of falling away, and that's just the nature of getting older. When you get to be at a certain age, the idea of getting 10 to 12 people together all on the same schedule, it's really really not that easy, and it's pretty sad that for all of these people to get together, it has to be only for a fantasy draft. Like I was talking to a friend of mine about this, and he was saying how he hates the fantasy league he plays in, but he just kind of does it for the draft. And I was just like, can't 10 to 12 guys just get together and just talk about football or whatever like that? Or do we need somehow, I don't know how people get this waiver from their significant others that, hey, I got a fantasy league, Jeff. One of the beautiful things about my girlfriend is that she has no idea about American sports whatsoever. So I don't think that that's going to be the greatest sell for her. Say, hey, babe, I've got to go to this thing that it will take me longer to explain to you what it is than it is to actually go do it or whatever. But once you stop drafting in person, that's kind of kills the leagues a little bit, I would say. And, just the leagues have just changed so much in general. I mean, again, like, all the different formats that are out there. It's just like people got bored of playing fantasy football, I think. And that's why we have all these new ridiculous league formats that come out year to year. And I laugh about this one now too, because being on the internet, I now realize I'm turning 40 this year. I am turning into the old guy on the internet. It is so hilarious to me when I have somebody who's probably in their 20s telling me how much more fun fantasy is or how much more watching a game is if I have fantasy on there. I'm well aware of it. I have plenty of experience in it. It's not always the most fun. Just throwing that one out there again. So yeah, I just don't. The other thing is that if you have the one league with friends, that's one thing that's always, great. I don't understand the people who have so many different teams. This is what got me inspired in this one. I was looking at a tweet and there was I'm so out of the loop on things. There was some actress or somebody famous, some girl, Kaylee Cuoco or something like that. I don't even know. I really am sounding every bit my age right now. But she was discussing how she has a boyfriend who had 10 fantasy football teams. What the fuck? If you have that many fantasy teams, you don't even know what you're rooting for. How is it even possibly fun? When a touchdown happens, there's a good chance, even if you have a guy, there's no way you have the same roster for every team, every league. And there's no way you have the same scoring and same rules for every league. So basically, when something happens, you have to sit there and then figure out whether or not it was good or bad or not. It's like there's nothing worse than, well, I mean, there's plenty of worse things, but I just think of, I used to hang out at bars with guys who had multiple teams. And they would start talking about, well, in this league, I need this. Instantly, I stopped listening. I might be looking at them and nodding my head, kind of like, yeah, no, that sounds awesome. I don't really care. They have to. You don't even know what you're rooting for. You just need action, and you're too much. If at that point, why aren't you just gambling? I mean, now 5 years ago, I would say is when sports betting started becoming legalized in many states in this country. I think in New York State where I live, it was 3 years ago it happened. But once that happened, because usually the idea is that, you build a team around the idea that a certain player is going to be good, even though you think a guy's going to have a good season. Football is a weird thing. Look at the stats that people accumulated over a 17-game season. I guarantee you, for some running backs and wide receivers, there's some guys, not the blue chip guys because they pretty much perform every week, but guys that do get played every week, probably half of their games were duds. And then they just had a couple of good games. Like that's always the feast or famine fantasy guys, where there's a couple guys who will have a couple 3 touchdown games here and there. And then nothing outside of that one. Then you look at their season at the end of the year, it's like, wow, he had 10 touchdowns and he had 1,200 yards. It's like, yeah. And half of those came in 3 games. It's just, the distribution of it. And then also, by the way, did it happen in a week that I played somebody that didn't have somebody going? I mean, there's just too much outside of your control factors on fantasy, I would say, for it to really be something to stress about too much. And again, I always blame this. It's probably cliche, if you're listening to this again, or not cliche, but it's something I've, a repeated take. But there used to be this organic fun that happened out of fantasy. The people that made the last place finish things, all the different little rules and just even the friendly banter amongst fantasy. Like that was something I was seeing on people, on Twitter or on social media posting, the shit talk that was going on before their championship games. And it's like, some people really treat this like life or death. They really treat it that if their fantasy team beats your fantasy team, they are somehow better at life or a better person. I don't know where we've gotten to. That's what I meant to expand upon this point as a guy who has a sports show or whatever. But I don't know where we got to this point where you don't know ball is really become a big thing. Like I don't know where this one came from. It's such a juvenile, just dumb, childish statement to say to somebody. But the idea that you are better than somebody because you know more about sports than them. Now, again, like, there's certain things you can prove. Like, I know more stats. Like, like if this guy has this, kind of stats, that's something that I got. It's in my blood or like that. My father's nickname was Stats Schofield to an extent because it was always, he knew a number. Then, people would debate about like, hey, this guy led the league this year and stuff like that. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Then, well, sure enough, you can look it up there. But now this idea that we argue about hypotheticals or things that can't be proven. And it's just, it is a great way it can be a way to pass time sometimes, but it's one thing when it's a discussion. It's another thing when it's an argument. And I think we've really slipped that line too much where nobody just talks sports anymore. And that's where I kind of plan on trending this one towards the end to wrap this one up, is the way that it is talking sports as a sports fan. I really, it's one of those things that I don't encourage anybody to gamble, but I just would say to somebody that, like, the daily fantasy league was a good thing because you didn't need to have a full commitment to something. And, there's nothing worse. And I remember somebody that I was friends with, I'm still friends with, but, I just don't talk to as much. But they were upset. They thought that it was unfair that their season ended when the fantasy football playoffs ended. Like, oh, why does everyone else get to, why don't I get to make it? That's the rule. That's just how the game is played. I don't know. I don't know what to tell you. It's not like if the only way, which by the way, too, everyone that claims they love football, if the only way that you can watch football is with some type of a vested interest, whether it be with a bet or with a fantasy interest, that just speaks levels to the quality of football these times. And now there is a little bit much, if I say that we've reached the tipping point of that too much of anything becomes a bad thing, where used to be any game that was on was an experience because we only had so many to watch. Now you can watch everything, and now it's just kind of all lost some of its value. There is the whole thing of that, I'm kind of what I guess the kids would call an old head. I've had to accept the fact that I think that the quality of sports has dropped off considerably. And there might be a little bit of truth in that one, but the truth is that I used to also not have access to watching everything. So because I get to watch everything, I also do get to see a lot of bad sports being played. So I will, take, that one into consideration. But yeah, so you're not really getting, I would say, the return on investment in fantasy sports. You're just basically looking for a reason to be pissed off, as far as I'm concerned. Or that's really, I've yet to, since I stopped playing fantasy, I'm a salesperson. I've yet to have somebody, and I challenge somebody to sell me on why I should still be playing fantasy. Because honestly, every time they tell me what they like about it, it just sounds awful. That's just the way it is. Congratulations to everybody that won something or whatever. But honestly, for the time and money that you invested into a fantasy football league, you could have done so much more with it. I joked around that literally the amount of, if you just went around your neighborhood rounding up cans, you probably would have profited about the same. And this is always the one that I go on. So fantasy football, football in general, it's slowly losing me. It just is what it is. I think it has a lot to do with the dependence on good quarterback play and the lack of good quarterbacks, or the shortage of good quarterbacks in the league. And by the way, it's only going to get worse. Right now we're looking at the NFL. I'd probably say conservatively, half the teams need a new quarterback. There's like 2 draft prospects coming out of this draft. So we're going to now put them on a pedestal, inflate their value. And then when you draft somebody in the first round, you kind of, especially at the quarterback, God forbid you don't start them their first year, because that's going to now create all kinds of controversy and all kinds of conversations at your facility that, oh, they don't think he's the guy. They don't think he's the guy, which sports media, same thing. Too much of everything's a bad thing. And I know that's, kind of ironic me saying this is a guy who is, well, I'd like to be a little bit more about sports. It just happens to be, it's mostly what my wheelhouse is in, or at least that's what kind of triggers a lot of conversation to me. When I have guests on, I like to be able to talk about anything and everything, which I'm working on kind of going. November and December were rough goes for me for many reasons, as far as trying to keep to a schedule on this one, and just, overall life gets in the way. It's just kind of the best way to put that one until this thing pays me, which until I start putting some effort into it, it probably never will. It's good. This is just what we have going forth. So where was I finishing on that? Oh yeah. So not huge on football as much more. Baseball is my one last safe haven. One thing I'll say about baseball is I know it's not for everybody. And again, that's another one too, is that people are so happy to tell me their displeasure for liking baseball. And I'm like, cool, guess what? You know what? If I'm watching baseball, I'm not bothering you. That's just kind of the way I look at it. Which maybe I should be hypocritical, because if I'm saying the people that play fantasy sports are no, because they do bother me, because people that have a fantasy team need to tell me about their fantasy team. Or here's the worst one. People that have fantasy teams that constantly are asking for fantasy advice. It is your team. Okay. When I played fantasy sports, I got a sense of satisfaction about me making all of the right decisions, or me being the benefactor of the luck, me controlling a little bit of the fate. That's kind of what the whole thing is that I would say that most people that play fantasy sports probably, or that really love it, probably never played any sports at a serious level whatsoever. And I mean, by serious, I'm saying maybe like high school level or so. It's a way of making them feel a part of the game. Don't get me wrong. As a gambler, I do that as well to feel part of the game. Although as I'm getting older, I'm kind of enjoying the idea of not watching and just checking the results. Gambling for me now is less about being involved in the game. It's more or less about me trying to grind out a couple dollars. And I've discovered that whether I'm watching or not, the results still happen. And again, I use this constant example of that my biggest bet of the NFL season was the Lions over the Vikings, their first matchup. And I looked and saw at the end of the final score, the Lions won 31-29 or something like that. And I was like, wow, that was a good game. When I looked back at the highlights of that game, or I looked through the game summary and I saw all the ebbs and flows of that, and the number of times that I was going to get my ass kicked, or the number of times I was kicking ass, I've said this before. For many people that watch fantasy and gambling, it's like people who watch sports for their fantasy interest or for their gambling interest, it's like you just ate acid and you're hoping to not have a bad trip. That's what the entire 3-hour experience is like. And if you have to watch it with these people, it's just unbelievable. And I also will say, unless I ever ask who you bets or what's your interest in this game is, I almost never care what it is. You know, there's a couple people that maybe get the exception of that one. You know, if somebody sends me and posts a parlay slip or something like that, you know, I have to reserve the judgment of saying, well, that was a terrible bet in the first place. Or, you know, it is what it is. There's some times that it's fun to compare losers here and there. I get that. There's people that are comfortable with that. There's other people that I could care less. It's just like, cool. Oh, every day you have one of these. Okay. Maybe get the hint. You're a fucking loser. I don't know what to tell you. But I digress on that one. So football doesn't do it for me. Fantasy football doesn't do it for me. So here's the one that I always laugh at is that, again, people have no problem telling me how much they hate baseball, whatever it is. I mean, I just happen to say, like, you know, the idea to people that I don't have a favorite football team, it's mind blowing to them. It's like, yeah, I was a Bills fan growing up. Unfortunately, I lived in Western New York for a while, lived amongst Bills fans for a while. And guess what? It just didn't really do it for me. When I was growing up as a Bills fan, you know why it was easy to be a Bills fan at that point in time? Because there were guys that, there was Jim Kelly, there was Andre Reed, there was Bruce Smith, there was Thurman Thomas. I had these core group of guys. It helped that they were Hall of Famers, but I knew who the nucleus of the team was every year. And I had I don't want to say relationship with them, but I had a little bit of an affinity to them. That's kind of gone. My rooting interests usually look behind me, St. Louis Cardinals in baseball. That has more to do with a family thing at this point. I mean, if you've been paying attention to this show the past year, I only really care for a sports team for good reasons. The Cardinals are heading for a dark stretch, and I'm going to watch them for the turnaround a little bit, but I don't have the investments in what happens out there. I just can't help but think about my uncle on Thanksgiving, who's a diehard New York Yankee fan, which, by the way, I don't know what the designation makes for somebody being a diehard. People just love to say that on there, but he's a loyal Yankee fan. He's been through his entire life. As he was describing, is that when the Yankees lost the World Series to the Dodgers, he was like, 20 years ago, he was like, I still might not be over this. He was like, now he's like, I was over it the next day, and that's just, it's sad to say that. And that's kind of my attitude, and that's been kind of a universal attitude amongst people in my family, at least anyways. It doesn't seem to be amongst everybody else there. And I'm not saying this that people in my family just got it all figured out or something. It's something I've noticed. But I do play fantasy baseball, And I look at it as for, well, I guess I can backtrack with fantasy baseball. I did not finish another point. I'm getting better on this one. With asking people for advice on fantasy football. Look, I don't mind if somebody, I find it flattering if somebody asks me for my opinion on something. I'm never going to dismiss that one. I do have the whole thing of that. If I do give you good advice, some gratuities are usually appreciated here and there, but I digress. But what I always can kind of say is that there's no universal fantasy format at this point anymore. When somebody asks me about a transaction, I always am going to say, I need more context. Now, if you ask me about a player, I can tell you what I think about a player. But if you're asking me about roster moves, I'm like, look, I need to see the rest of the league. Or this is always the one that kills me. Somebody that wants to send me a screenshot of their roster, like they're a proud baby. And I have a good friend that does this, and I make fun of him every time about it, where it's just like, okay, I don't care. Okay. Oh, every roster is going to have a bunch of good names on there. I need to see the other rosters in the league. I need to see the scoring formats. All of these things kind of matter in how I drive my decisions. And that especially is true of what I play is fantasy baseball. Fantasy baseball, there are a million different ways to skin that cat. I play, probably the least popular formats amongst casual fantasy players, I guess I would say, which is Roto League, which Roto League is absolutely phenomenal because guess what? With fantasy football, you are limited to, I have these positions and I only score points these ways. Baseball, bunch of different moving parts in that one. There's many different ways to skin that cat as far as, which is that even an expression I can even use on YouTube? I mean, I don't have to worry about being demonetized on YouTube. No money coming in, but I just have to wonder if that phrase, it's kind of one of those ones I've noticed that when I say that phrase in 2025 now, I get a couple weird looks where I'm like, oh, was that the PETA ruled that one out by any chance? I did have someone say something that we don't have to use cat's fur for coats one time to me. I don't care. I'm just going to continue to say it's, there's worse hills to die on. Or there's probably better hills to die on, but I'm still going to continue to use that expression if it pops in my head. So yeah, fantasy baseball, bunch of different formats, stuff like that. When somebody asks me for advice on that one, that's the one I do get to ask the most advice on because I have kind of become synonymous with being a huge baseball fan. And, I'll appreciate that. I'm always going to be able to give you an evaluation of a player, things I like about them, things I don't like about them. But again, having the context of your league does matter. And again, it is your fantasy football team or your fantasy baseball team. So you should care a little more. But I will always laugh at that people who are the most diehard fantasy football fans who love fantasy sports. That's just what they, their whole thing. They will tell me when I say, hey, you want to play, you should play fantasy baseball sometime. Oh, I don't have the time. I don't have the time for that. These are the same people who are going to be researching, meaningless research, all fantasy football off season, watching all that stuff like that. It does not, when I played fantasy football, I'll tell you this one, it didn't take me much time either. Every set of transactions I made, all my lineups are set throughout the course of one trip to the bathroom. All right. I hop on one day, I put in my waiver requests, maybe two trips. That's my one trip to the bathroom. I kind of set this here and there. I plot out the lineup there. Then after the waivers clear, I make another trip to the bathroom. I've got my lineup set. If there's an injury, concern or something like that, maybe there's a third trip to the bathroom on Sunday where I make my final moves, but that's about it. Probably 5 to 10 minutes a week for me, which I know is I say that because I look at how little control over I have this and how luck-based it is. That's about all the time I'm willing to commit to that one. But even when you look at it this way, over the course of a 17-week season, I mean, that's still at least, that's still an hour and a half of my time. That's on the low end of things. Okay. Trust me. There are people out there who definitely put way more time and effort into that one. They're probably up to, again, whereas I say the amount of hours they put into it at the end of the year and any money that they win, it's probably like, hey, cool. You could have just worked a fucking shift. You could have worked a 4-hour shift at a grocery store, stocking shelves and probably gotten the same out of it. But then you don't have a cool story to tell. So that's kind of my thoughts on that one. But with baseball, I'll tell people that, okay, you should give this one a shot. They'll tell me they don't have enough time, which again, the fantasy baseball league, it takes me about 5 minutes a day. Again, I mostly, not to get too deep into detail on this one, but most all of my transactions are done on the toilet. Or I do have, because baseball happens every day and I love to watch it, I can do this weird thing where while I'm watching baseball, I might log on real quickly. And the reason I enjoy baseball is that because it's such a long season, is that it does provide me this nice tool of how to really monitor what's going on out there. As far as you will start noticing what players are performing at a high level for periods of time and what players aren't for levels of time. Again, I play in a league I pay like $200 for, and I haven't won anything. I've joined this league 13 years ago, and I finished second place the 1 year, and I don't think I've won anything ever since. I had some really bad luck. I was almost on the idea of quitting on this one because, well, let's just say the year I built my best team ever was in 2020. Had a pitching staff that was built around Trevor Bauer. Nothing like having a young pitcher in the prime of his career whose career ends not because of injury. Just going to leave it at that one, which that one was almost as bad as, I did have the 1 year. I've had some really bad luck on this one, and this isn't, have anyone feel sympathy on this one, but I remember 1 year I decided to keep Carlos Carrasco, and then the next, 2 days later, it was announced he was diagnosed with cancer. There's a little bit of bad luck on that one. Obviously more serious things in my fantasy team, but back to the idea of not having enough time. It's a couple minutes a day, and the idea is that if you like playing fantasy sports of any kind, then why would you not like something that requires more time and effort into it? This one, because really what comes down to is that if you play Roto Fantasy Baseball, no one has ever been lucky to win one, okay? Even if you have the best roster at the draft and you get lucky without guys being injured, there is still some maneuvering around there, okay? Even your best player has a 10-game stretch where they contribute nothing, making some lineup decisions here and there. The strategy at which how you build your team, because it's an ever-changing thing. Again, for those of you who don't play Roto Fantasy, I would encourage you, if you're a football player, let's just describe this. In baseball, we have pitching categories and we have hitting categories. So the league that I play in, I believe we go 6x6. We have 6 pitching categories, 6 hitting categories. What we do is I'll just say that we have strike it for pitching. We'll just use strikeouts as a category. There's a 10-team league. The guy with the most strikeouts has 10 points. The guy with the least strikeouts has 1 point. For hitting, you have home runs. The guy with the most home runs has 10 home runs. The guy with the least 10 points, the guy with the least home runs has 1 point. We do that for all of the major categories. So as the course of the season kind of goes on, you can always adapt on the fly, change up your strategies. You can play towards one category 1 week and then play towards another one the other week. And it's just all about getting this most well-rounded team. I think it's a great way to play things. It's something that I enjoy, and it doesn't involve as much luck. And also, I'm not encouraging just random people to play it. Just the people that, when they play fantasy football, I'm just like, if you really actually enjoy doing these things, wouldn't you enjoy something that you can actually see the fruits of your labor a little bit more? It doesn't happen that way. Where I'm going with all of this is that I just want to think about how much different being a sports fan in 2025 is versus in 2005. So in 2005, I was in college. And I will say that, ESPN really kind of molded a lot of our patterns of behavior. Once upon a time, that was the only show in town. Then Fox Sports kind of started coming into things, but they didn't have any big names necessarily. But basically the whole thing is that I used to joke around that when I had cable was just a reason for me to have ESPN on. If you were at my house, ESPN was on all the time, because SportsCenter used to do this weird thing where we showed highlights. Your debate shows had just really started taking off, but we didn't really have too much of them. But those were kind of just like a nice, like PTI was the perfect show. I really think PTI is actually the one that kind of ruined this because it was such a success. But during that time period where you got tired of watching the same highlights over again, and you were waiting for the games to start that night, Around the Horn and PTI was good because you got some different perspective from some sports talk journalist guys. These were also when the best of the best were talking on there. And I say this as a guy who's recording this right now, but this is the changing thing. Now, every Tom, Dick, and Harry and Ryan Schofield out there has an outlet to discuss sports. You can really, really get specialized with this one. But at least when they had all these guys that we were listening to before on ESPN, they all had some kind of credentials before, is that they were sports journalists, and they also had a little bit of they had worked at their craft on television. Now we just get athletes, and I'll tell you that athletes understand sports on a different level. And I've used this expression a million times, is that if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one here to make a sound, does it really, or there's no one there to hear it, does it really make a noise? if somebody is the smartest person in the world and nobody can bear to listen to them, does it even fucking matter? That's how I feel about a lot of athletes making the transition to television, is that a lot of them, they may know their craft, but they know it on a level that only they understand. And they maybe just aren't the best at articulating, but now it's just kind of former athletes. Now it's just kind of going straight from the field to the studio. And, how many of them work out? I mean, like Tom Brady, most people hate on Tom Brady. Tom Brady's the greatest quarterback of all time. And then some people say he's the worst sports commentator of all time. He strikes me as a guy who's eventually going to get better on that one. But, that's just kind of the route that we've gone on. But everything now has to be an issue. Like, again, did anybody at any point in time watch the Patriots or the Raiders this year and say that's a well-coached football team? No, it never happened. It never happened. Okay. Maybe when you took former players, okay, and in this case, linebackers, Antonio Pierce. I mean, everything has become any coach that got fired. I mean, I don't know all the, I don't have the data in front of me right now, but coaches got fired this year. Some of them are black, some of them are white. Whenever a black coach gets fired, it always has to turn into the whole race angle. I mean, everything in sports now has to be examined through a race angle, which is just, I remember in 2005, maybe they just didn't want to talk about it, but that was not the case. It was kind of just, sports. One of the beautiful things is that it was kind of decided on merit. It's the way it was. I mean, we used to have this whole thing of that. It's amazing how there was a period of time, and I've heard the old man racists talk about, we'll just say the example of black quarterbacks in the NFL. For such a racist league, they really love to draft black guys playing quarterback. It's just, it's amazing how many, I think like almost, what is it? But about a half, I feel like it's like a 50-50 mix as far as black and white quarterbacks in there. But anytime one of them loses their job, I mean, the MVP right now, it's amazing how Lamar Jackson won the MVP over Josh Allen, no ifs, ands, or buts last year, and everything was all fine. And now that Josh Allen might win this year, we're back to being racist. I need that one explained to me. Never probably going to get an explanation. Everything just has to go through that lens. And again, I don't know how much of it is because of the negative attention gets a lot of attention, or negative comments gets a lot of attention out there, or how much social media shapes our thinking, or the fact that ESPN, which I said, I've been calling, it's hilarious. I love my On This Day on Facebook, where I can just look back, and I was around 2010 talking about how ESPN is going to be, this is when they were, dubbing themselves as the worldwide leader in sports. I was calling for their imminent end on there. The only time I have ESPN on now is when there's a sporting event on there. And to be honest with you, once the football playoffs is over, I'm probably going to be canceling my cable package, because basketball and college basketball, two sports I used to really, really care about, just ain't doing it for me anymore. I'll just be shifting my attention towards preseason baseball. Hopefully the Cardinals, this young group of guys out there, I'm not letting the Cardinals set me up for failure this year. I just want to see the next group of Cardinals players come up there and give me a reason see who might be around in 2 or 3 years when they start competing again. That's really all I'm getting out of this one. But where I want to end up on this one is that I've been, saying that with fantasy sports, people should just, again, if you have an idea about a player, you have a player you like to follow or root for, or you just have a strong feeling on how someone's going to do in a given week, they've got prop wagering for that. You can just bet on just one thing. I'd rather than having a whole roster of guys that needs to do their thing. How about the one guy I like the most about, I just throw down some money on whether he's going to have a certain amount of receiving yards or a certain amount of catches, or he's going to score a touchdown. Granted, the odds that are set are going to be terrible because they've gotten really, really wise to that one. Very tough to find value in this game right now. Like, hey, this is a great one. Everyone that knew that Mike Evans needed at least 86 yards or whatever it was to get an incentive bonus, guess what? FanDuel was pretty smart. The lowest number they offered on him was 90 yards. So, and guess what? He had 89 yards. Now, by the way, too, it's also funny that, everyone now the sports being rigged thing, because gambling is going on, so they just started it. They just started rigging them now. Before, it was, there's always been people saying it's rigged, but now it's really, really rigged. And it's mostly because people lost shitty bets. But it's funny that because so many favorites won outright, FanDuel, they're at a $370 million shortfall for their projections or whatever. For all these sports betting, companies to have so much control over the league, it's amazing that could ever happen. It's almost as if that maybe it's a little bit more random than people think it is. But for me to have a sports conversation now, I need to have the only good sports conversations I feel like I have now. The comment I made, I posted a TikTok on of was that at one point in time, it seemed like the only time I could have a good sports conversation was if somebody bet on sports. 5 years later now, I'm willing to say, now that we've had this mass influx of gambling, which I have one other point on there. If somebody doesn't gamble is when I could probably have a good sports conversation with them, because it's tough to just, if we start talking about players or anything, any type of matchup, it all turns into with the betting angle, Like I have one friend that doesn't gamble or play sports. Or fantasy sports. I think I only have one friend that meets that criteria. He's the only person I can actually just have a legitimate, good sports conversation with. He's even more of a unicorn. He's a Buffalo Bills fan, and he's a realist about the Buffalo Bills. In fact, I think I'm going to be having him on the show next week. So that'll be good, because doing these solo episodes is not always the easiest. It's nice to be able to converse with somebody. I'm so much better when I have someone to talk to, I guess I would say. But my schedule makes it hard for me to guarantee other people's schedules and the different time zones and yada, yada, yada. And then round and round we go. But it's just not the same. I mean, everything is looked at through the gambling and fantasy lens. I mean, I don't really watch a lot of regular sports media these days, but I do notice that, this is the one that's killer, is that especially now that ESPN has their own betting app, it is so painfully obvious listening to people talk about betting and that have no idea about betting. And there's so many more of them out there. Like, people don't understand point spreads or like that. I probably understand it too well. Okay. It's crazy to think that as a 39-year-old about to be turning 40, that I've been doing this for well over half of my life. I was able to turn a profit in 2025. There were some ups and downs throughout there, but I still put it this way. I know that I'm doing something right, because somebody put up a comment or a comment on Twitter, or a post on Twitter about that FanDuel give you a deposit bonus. I really don't get shit for bonuses from sportsbooks anymore. I'm in that nice little gray area of that. I don't lose enough money, or I don't lose money, so I don't get offered all these little great incentives on there. I don't win enough money that I get any type of special limits placed on me. I will say there was one time, it was such a flattering moment, where I went to put in a bet that actually ended up losing, by the way, where it had to be submitted for review because it was a much larger bet than I normally make. And go figure, it was one of my largest bets and I lost it. It was a couple of years ago on the Lakers to miss the playoffs, which in hindsight, that was a bad idea. But it's that stupid play-in format thing. I didn't quite understand how all that worked. But anyways, I thought that I was making the bet that they wouldn't make like the original playoffs. And anyways, that's just a story for another day. But basically what I do is I made enough money on sports to say that I didn't lose money betting on sports. And yeah, I will tell you right now that if I was to offer one pick out there right now, I'm going to go with the great in baseball. Last year I had the Kansas City Royals at 22-1 to win their division. They did not win it, but certainly I got some positive value out of that bet for sure. They were at one point leading the division in like late August, I want to say, and then it just all completely fell apart for them. Vinny Pasquantino's wrist injury. I think right now the wager that I'm really fixated on is, as the St. Louis Cardinals fan, I look at what the Cincinnati Reds are doing, and I'll leave you on this one. I think the Reds are like 5-1 right now to win the NL Central. I'm willing to take a flyer on that bet. Getting the veteran manager in Terry Francona with their lovely staff and things, but I'm all over the place. Maybe I shouldn't have had that third cup of coffee today. But no, as I would say that I just think about, I used to work with a guy who didn't bet sports at all, and he was a soccer fan, and soccer's a sport I enjoy now because I don't know enough about it. I bet on it, but I don't I know how to evaluate stats, but I can't sit there and watch it and make any suggestions or whatever. I had a coworker that I worked with that was a huge soccer fan, lived over in England when he was stationed in the military for a little while. And he would discuss things with me. And while he was talking about certain games and certain matchups, I'd get these little gems, and then I would cross-reference what he would tell me into the betting apps. And I hit a couple of pretty good bets based on information that he had. Then what happened? He started betting, and then his advice turned into shit because he started looking at things not as a sports fan, but as a gambler. And that's really become the problem among sports fans, is that everybody looks at it through their own financial lens, whether it be their fantasy team, whether it be their bets, and it's really just kind of ruining the whole thing. The purity is gone, okay? We already look at, college football, okay, cool, we got the playoff coming on here, but the NIL and the transfer portal, you can't tell me that the quality of play is anywhere near what it was. And it's because now sports are being lost to me. Now let's look at it this way. Every high schooler, I can say this myself, okay? I was fucking 5'6" and 155 pounds or whatever, and when I was in high school, I played lacrosse. I had it in my head that there was a potential that I could get a scholarship to play sports. Okay, never even happened. I never even ended up. Well, I guess you could say I sort of played college lacrosse, but that's a different conversation for another day. I practiced with the college lacrosse team for a little bit, anyways. I got asked to play again, but I was also on the verge of failing out of school, so that's a different story. But if I was in this current era, with when at that, take me from 2003 and put me in this era, I would probably think that I could monetize myself on social media playing lacrosse. I would probably think that there was some type of an NIL deal I could get out there. I would not be playing sports for the sake of playing sports. I'd be playing it for the sake of money. That is now, I don't know what level it really starts, but now we now have younger kids are now that this is actually a business opportunity for them. And once money starts taking over, again, I hate sounding like that guy, but it just ruins all the purity of it. We don't play sports to see who the best man is. We see what can this do for me. And that's just kind of where I end this on. It's not the greatest. It's not our best foot going forward. And I fight this battle, and I argue this with a buddy all the time. And he says, "Well, then I guess you're gonna have to find a new hobby." And truth be told, I kind of have been. So we'll continue to see how this road goes. I mean, I'm not even going to go out of my way to watch any of the NFL playoff games, probably. I mean, if I happen to catch them, but it's amazing how I can find myself scrolling aimlessly on my phone during riveting television like the NFL playoffs sometimes. And I'll leave on that note. Everybody, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening to the Scho-Zone. Like, subscribe, comment, share, and all that douchebag stuff that podcast hosts say. Again, I'm going to start trying to have these back, posting audio episodes onto all the different podcast platforms. And I'm really going to try to be focusing on recording every Monday and Wednesday. Really wish I could lock down a time, but there's just too many moving parts of my day. So until then, take it easy, everybody.